Don't be surprised if one day you get a call from the cemetery where your loved one's remains are, and they tell you that they have to move your family's remains and you have to pay for the excavation, which could be thousands and thousands of dollars. This has happened to many people. The city will relocate local cemeteries and often have the remains sent to cemeteries much farther away. It's a scary reality, but a reality all the same.
There's really no law set in place governing the abandonment of cemeteries. Nearly every state in America has dozens of cemeteries that are run down, no longer cared for, and destined to be forgotten. And there's even more cemeteries hiding under buildings, roads, and schools that we've yet to discover. Thousands of years worth of burying and building, all on top of one another. And the cycle will continue.
To have a grave preserved and kept throughout the centuries is a privilege for a limited few. The chances of your grave being on display for hundreds or even thousands of years is completely unlikely.
In Colorado's Rocky Mountains, there are two cemeteries which have posed a mystery for years. They are located in Cripple Creek and Victor. There are 46 gravestones that are inscribed with nothing more than the words "Unknown Soldiers."
In Poland, 27 cemeteries were destroyed during World War II, or they were bulldozed purposely after the end of the war. Thousands and thousands of people completely wiped away from history in a matter of hours. Today, there's only one small memorial gravesite left to remember all of these people. And just how long will it be before the current memorial gets wiped away from history too?
In the 18th century, several battles took place in the United States. The War of 1812 lasted roughly 3 years and ended in 1815. The Mexican War lasted 2 years from 1846 to 1848, and shortly after, what is known as the Indian Wars took place. Though this war spanned nearly a century, historians use the dates 1850 to 1890.
It's been estimated that a total of 21,586 casualties resulted from the Indian Wars. 31% were civilians and 69% were Native Americans.
In 1993, the Florida Department of Transportation uncovered evidence of 6 graves while clearing land for road work and upgrading Edison Bridge in Fort Myers.
This project included road improvements, and it was the widening of US 41 when it becomes Fowler Street in Fort Myers once you cross over the Caloosahatchee River. The streets affected by the improvements were Fowler Street and 2nd Street, which is only a couple miles from Henry Ford's home and Edison's home. In compliance with Chapter 872 of Florida statutes, the FDOT hired an outside archaeological research company named ACI.
ACI mapped the area with ground-penetrating radar and exhumed 6 corpses. During the process of exhumation and further field investigation, an additional 14 burials were discovered.
What makes this story more interesting than just the fact that the current local community and visitors to this beautiful waterfront city have been driving to work, walking their dog, and jogging over displaced bodies for centuries. ACI, the archaeological consulting firm, provided a summary report that stated that the disturbed and fragmentary nature of the burials and the scant amount of associated cultural materials signifies that this grave of 16 or more people had already been exhumed in the late 19th century.
In 1841, on November 1st, that area was established as Fort Harvey, named after Lieutenant John Harvey of the 8th Infantry. This place would serve as the Army's principal depot for operations in southwest Florida during the Second Seminole War. The fort remained active until March of 1842. This post was reactivated 8 years later and renamed for the Chief Quartermaster of the Department of Florida, Colonel Abraham Myers, which is why it is now known as Fort Myers today.
It continued to be an operational base for the Third Seminole War from 1855 to 1858. then reactivated in January of 1865 and manned by Union forces.
This fort was an important shelter for Union sympathizers that lived in the Gulf Coast community, which is now considered to most as gallant. But keep in mind what it must have felt like to live in a region and time where one would have to travel thousands of miles to be in states that were once part of the Union.
Documented evidence for a cemetery first appears in a certified copy of an 1886 subdivision plat which shows the 100-acre Fort Myers town site, surveyed by J.G. Arista.
According to Arista's plat, there's a U.S. cemetery in 1851 on the north side of 2nd Street. The strange east and west configuration of Lot 6 may be associated with the orientation of a cemetery, but the actual perimeter of the cemetery may be unknown by the surveyor. A first-hand account from someone named Gonzalez in 1932 said it was a large cemetery encompassing military burials from the 1840s to the 1850s. Yet the boundaries for this defunct cemetery were not indicated or identified.
A woman named Mrs. Nettie Pearl Menge Batty owned the property around the cemetery and told historian Walter Burke that they were coming up with bones while they were planting their trees.
Right before the turn of the century, in 1888, the property that once served as a military and civilian cemetery for possibly 100 years was in the area of a high demand due to location, because it was close to a new and thriving small city district. It was this year in which they moved hundreds of graves across town to a larger cemetery.
Though it was difficult to determine race or gender from the remains, they all would have been buried around the late 1840s to 1850s.
In summary, the improvement of Fowler and 2nd Street uncovered human remains, which led to archaeological investigations and historical research that focused on the exhumation, dating, and final interment of the human remains found. In total, the partial remains of 16 individuals were unearthed. The bones consisted of 14 adults and 2 children. However, 20 burial features or headstones were discovered. The graves seem to have been either overlooked or left behind by the workers who were transferring the graves from one location to the other.
The final analysis of historical data, along with archaeological evidence, is that the previous exhumations focused on just a portion of a much larger U.S. military graveyard.
The boundaries of the original cemetery are undocumented and unknown. That means to date, all of the unsuspecting business owners and homeowners are going about their daily jobs, likely with thousands of corpses still buried beneath their feet.
An investigation into the area that was once historic Fort Brooke led to finding the burials of 126 individuals, 42 of which were Native Americans, while 2 are thought to be African American.
According to reports prepared for the city of Tampa by Piper and Piper in the year 1982, they state in their report that lying outside the official bounds of Fort Brooks U.S. Military Cemetery, the previously unknown burials were discovered to have dated at the same time as the military burials. While the military burials were carefully recorded and transferred to a national cemetery, upon the decommissioning of Fort Brooke, civilian and Indian burials outside the military cemetery were not only moved, but through time became totally unknown.
World War I began on 1914 and would be known as one of the deadliest battles in history, second only to World War II. Today, the United States still doesn't know how many Americans died while serving abroad or buried on foreign soil.
World War II was actually the deadliest battle in history. Between 70 to 80 million people lost their lives. At the time, that was about 3% of the world's population.
Currently, the United States has no database of every American service member buried overseas. The reason for this is because finding all the soldiers that fought and died is a complicated process for many reasons. Throughout World War I and World War II, soldiers fought many battles in which platoons were scattered over vast expansions of land across several continents. Most have been buried in memorial or private cemeteries, yet others were placed in isolated burial sites, or worse, mass graves.
One example is from 2019. The graves of over 30 United States Marines and sailors who lost their lives in World War II were found at Tarawa Atoll, a remote atoll in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean.
On November 20th in 1943, the United States would face off against the Imperial Japanese Navy in what would become one of the first times in the Pacific War that the U.S. would face serious opposition from the Japanese and Korean forces. It's estimated that over 6,000 people lost their lives in just 76 hours, including 1,100 U.S. military personnel.
Only 500 U.S. service members were buried in the cemetery on that island.
A nonprofit organization named History Flight uncovered the remains of 30 missing U.S. military members, and they've had their hand in recovering hundreds of remains from numerous wars. A man named Chris Dicken has cataloged the burials of roughly 36 American members of the military that are not in an official U.S. cemetery outside of the U.S. or overseas. In an interview with reporter Elizabeth Schell for PBS, Dicken makes note that during World War I, 300 to 400 Americans fought in the French Foreign Legion, and this being the only recognition of them serving in the war.
Referring to Dickens' books published in the 1920s, he said, "There are no current books or research about these soldiers."
Dicken points to another example where there's a cemetery in Belgium that has the remains of over 24 American soldiers, but not a single grave indicates that they're American. He said to look at them, you could think that they're either Canadian or British.
According to a report written by defense correspondent Thomas Harding, the families of millions of soldiers buried in unmarked graves in World War I could be able to finally locate their relatives' place of burial due to the work and investigative research done by British historian Peter Barton. Mr. Barton claims that he unearthed a large, mostly unused archive in Geneva, Switzerland, that was hidden deep under the Red Cross headquarters. The typed records had been boxed and remained untouched for many years. The information in this vast archive could potentially indicate where a majority of those who lost their lives along the Western Front have been laid to rest. This gives hope to many families and loved ones. Anyone interested in learning more about where the remains and graves have been found of those that fought for us in the U.S. military can view an up-to-date interactive map online. We implore everyone to take the time and visit this map, get a closer perspective of the importance of finding those who died fighting for our rights and for our freedom.